Hi everyone, I'm Nicola Telford. I'm here with Daphne Tideman for a session about decoupling your growth rates from your happiness, especially when things aren't working. I'm the founder of Views for Change and the Impact Marketing Club, and Daphne is part of the Impact Marketing Club, which is really exciting. But I'm going to shut up because I really want to hear your intro and a bit about your story, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, sure. So I started in growth when basically growth hacking was just not really an existing area. I just fell in love with the idea that it was a combination of the data side and the creative side. And I felt like marketing didn't do that as much at the time. So when I came across the growth hacking agency, Rob Bruce, I joined them as their first employee and basically helped grow them to 25 people and got to help grow all different kinds of companies along the way. I was there for about 5 years. And then from there, I decided to write a book about how to basically grow clients and all the lessons and learnings from that time of what works and what doesn't work. But I also really wanted to try out the brand side and make sure that I was working for impact brands, which is what kind of led me to my first impact brand. I worked for Heights, which is focused on brain care. And I joined them as their head of growth. Again, when they were still quite small, they only had about 700 monthly subscribers. And over the course of 18 months there, got to grow the team and also grow the subscriber base by 10x. But I realized I missed that variation. And I also felt like personally that I could have a bigger impact if I was working with different brands. So I set up my own business about a year ago, and then half a year ago, I decided to go full-time working with eco-friendly and wellness D2C brands to help them grow. And figure out like what's holding the growth back, why is growth slowing down, how to set up their growth team, and just give them the tools to be successful. So yeah, that's me.
Amazing. I mean, that's so exciting. And for anyone that doesn't follow or is connected with Daphne on LinkedIn, you should, because you're constantly posting really good advice and in ways that people can manage it. And that's how we ended up having this conversation as well, because I saw your post about the marathon and talking about this idea of happiness and growth being interlinked. So the title of this is about decoupling growth rates from your happiness. I think it's probably fair to say that lots of people can relate to that. In fact, if we're honest with ourselves, I think most people, especially in the spaces that we're operating, would definitely do that. So their mood and their energy and the team energy as well is changing with the charts that they're following. So what experience have you had of that? And let's explore that a bit, and then I'm happy to share mine as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think just to explain the post that you saw, I was running a half marathon. It's called the Big Half in London as preparation for the marathon. And so it wasn't actually meant to be a race for time. It was meant to just be a race to train and get a feel for the course of the marathon. And I'd also made the really bad choice of celebrating my birthday the night before. So I was also, I forgot about it when I planned it in, and I'd already moved it once. And it's been so long since we could have a birthday party. So I was like, it's fine. I'm going to still go. I'm going to still run. And so I'm there, not on the most sleep, not in the freshest state. But I can't help but want to run a sub-2 half marathon, because my previous half marathon I did was 2 hours and 5 seconds, which is a very annoying time. So I was like, no, I have to get this half under. And so I knew I was below the 2 because I was running ahead of the paces for 2 hours. I started with them, and then I started seeing like other people overtake me. And it just made me really think of like with growth, like how we're just constantly focused on other people's growth rates. And I was so frustrated. And I was like, the fact that I'm even here in this state running it, I'm on track to do it in sub-2. I ended up doing it in like 1:58. I was like, but I'm so unhappy with it because I'm just constantly looking at other people. And then someone was holding a sign, and I just remember seeing it and being like, that is exactly the sign I needed to see. And it was like, run your own race. And I saw it a few times throughout it. And I don't think those people realize what an impact it had just to remind yourself to run your own race. And it also just made me realize like how much of the time I was unhappy with certain growth rates because I was just comparing myself to other businesses of how fast they were growing, the results. Every time I saw someone on LinkedIn who was like, they were like, oh, we had 30% growth. Oh, we doubled in the last 2 months. It just made me unhappy. And I think also hearing a lot of clients later on, them just having the same thought, I was like, this is so unhelpful. And so I think that's one of the reasons why happiness gets linked to our growth rate. But I think like the other thing is just like we have this recency bias of like the last month of growth, that's like how we feel. So when it's going really well, it's like, oh, it's amazing, it's incredible, and we're doing so well. And then when it's not going well, it's like the motivation is down, the team vibes are down, and it just becomes such a roller coaster. And I think it's because we expect that we should have 20% month-on-month growth because that's what some people are boasting about. But I think it's also just like this feeling that, when you have the title of founder or head of growth, it just feels like such a big responsibility. Like you should be doing growth rather than it being a team effort. And I think that's another reason why we end up, being unhappy about it. So that's what happens when you have 2 hours to think during a half marathon.
I mean, I'm just sort of thinking while you're speaking there, and like I have similar things in my life, and I think maybe this is like a symptom of society, and then we're applying it also to how we operate in business. But like where in COVID, I started walking every morning, like most people did. You just go for a walk. I still do it now, and it's like the linchpin of my day. But for a while, I was getting ridiculously competitive with myself about like a morning walk that should be an energizing thing that's like start your day right. But I'd be like, because I've got like a watch that tells me how many steps I've done or how far I've been or how fast I'm walking or whatever. And then I started running, and then I started doing all that stuff, and you're attached to Strava, so you're like looking at what everyone else is doing, and there was one day when I was like, why aren't I just like enjoying the walk? Like, why aren't I just looking up at the, trees or whatever, or having a nice time and using it for that? Or, I'd have the same with like, how many, could I fit enough podcasts in that day to learn something while I'm doing it to make it useful? And anyway, I could go on about that forever, but it's really interesting that we've become so competitive with ourselves. And then that seeps into, well, it is like probably in its entirety when we're at work or when we're growing. That's the way that we see things, because we're applying that to everything.
I think I was just going to say, I think you forget the end goal of it. Like if you ask like, what's your North Star metric, what's your goal? It's not like, it shouldn't be, at least it shouldn't be a growth rate. It shouldn't be revenue. It should be your purpose. Like, why did you start this business? And I think it's the same with like a walk. Why did you actually go for a walk? Was it to beat your personal best in terms of distance? Then sure, it's good to look at that. But if it was just to get some fresh air and feel better, and like, this is a whole different subject, but I really recommend reading, if you haven't, 4,000 Weeks. It talks about like how we have only 4,000 weeks in our lives, and how when you think about that, we put so much pressure, but then we actually don't enjoy living. And I think it's the same with growth. It's like at a certain point, like we put so much pressure on it that we don't enjoy growing anymore, and we forget that bigger mission. And I think it is good to think about like, okay, how are we doing better? But better isn't last month. Better is like, where were we a year ago at the same time? Because there's seasonality, there's different factors. And better is also like, not just in terms of growth rate, but how is the culture of the company we're building? How have we learned better what drives growth? How are we making our customers happy? Are we closer, or do we have product market fit now compared to before? And not all of those things are directly reflected in the last short-term month growth rate.
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, obviously a lot of this stuff is related to what goals you set for yourself. And do you think that sort of idea that we're in the now and we're in the like most recent month and the next month contributes to this sort of unrealistic goal setting? Because, you're not looking at the year-on-year growth or you're not sort of looking above you're not like coming up for air to have a look at what's actually going on in the grand scheme. So why do you think we're setting goals like that, and how do we sort of change that approach?
So I think it comes from a few things. I think for the companies that are investor backed, that growth rate is quite important. I think the other thing is just like we created a culture where it's a good measure. And then the other thing is like when you set goals too long, then you just also lose that kind of momentum. So I think it's also been a really good way to have that shorter term momentum and focus and drive. Because like it's that idea of Parkinson's law, like when tasks expand to the time you have. And so if it's like, oh, we have 3 months to reach 20% growth versus 1 month, you could stretch out 3 months. So I think like those are the kind of reasons that it happens. And also just this feel, like I say, this comparison, what we talked about already, this feeling like if other companies are doing this, then we should be doing this too. But it just, it is dangerous because it just, growth is short and long-term things. And like you say, we lose sight of what we do in a year and what we build in a year. And like, for example, at one point when we so focused on the short-term growth rate at Heights, like I think we stopped investing in a lot of the longer term things, like building the brand awareness, growing the email list. And we were so focused on like, okay, what can bring the customers in that month? And the result was then in the end, we actually saw slower growth, because when I analyzed the data and took a step back, I actually saw that when we had a period of social or email or podcast list and growth, like basically anything I'd call community or like, audience, it was 2 months later that we saw that end growth. But because often growth rates are tied to number of customers, we get very focused on conversion focus versus building the brand.
And I guess as well, like, I mean, I talked to Phil Keel about this on our live a couple of weeks last week, maybe, about this idea of like, not only short term and long term or medium term or whatever term, but also quality of acquisition. So are you growing with the right people? Are you actually meeting their needs, or are they going to buy once and then never come back? Because the sort of like lifetime value and things like that of a customer like that isn't as valuable as one that you've maybe spent a bit more on, but they're really there for what you want. So there's so many sort of questions around that. And I think one thing that's really interesting to me is this idea that the sort of team dynamic that changes when you feel that sort of panic that things aren't going quite right because you haven't hit the numbers that you're supposed to this month, or whatever it is. But then it's often the people that are responsible for the growth part of the business, whether that's a specific founder or a head of growth, which is probably a fairly early hire in a lot of startups. But that then filters in a sort of really negative way. So there's sort of pressure to reach these goals, but it's higher on the people that are to blame or to responsible. They're obviously not, but they're sitting in that role that has the title growth in it. So therefore they're the ones that we're looking at when things aren't going quite right. And I mean, we're going to talk about like reasons why things can slow down and all that sort of stuff, but how do we reframe that to become a sort of team effort rather than a like, you're head of growth, therefore like you're on the sort of in the stocks, as it were?
So I think there's like two things that kind of happen, and then we can talk about like how to make it a team effort. I think the first thing is that there's a ripple effect as a manager. When I first was a manager at Rock Boost, I was still really young. That's the growth agency I was working for. And I didn't realize how much my emotions rippled through the organization. So I think like, even if you feel like the end responsibility, feeling that big weight, it ripples through because you're leading the growth meeting. It's where you have the enthusiasm, but it's also, you're the one presenting the figures, and presenting bad figures every single time really, really sucks. And makes you dread the meeting and then come with the wrong energy, which ripples through the team. And then the second part, I think, is that I personally, and I've had the title before, and I don't have a full solution to it, but I think head of growth is a really dangerous title because it's implying that one person can be head of everything. And sure, a CEO might be like, overseeing everything, but they're not in the weeds of every single area. And like with a head of growth, like growth comes from brand, comes from marketing, comes from product, comes from culture, comes from strategy, in all these different areas. And so I think that's part of the reason why this pressure results. It's not this feeling of like people thinking like, oh, I am end responsible, but just this title, like that, like you say, the minute something goes wrong, everyone turns to the head of growth for like, why is this happening? And so to make it a team effort, I think the first thing is really communication, and just having this talk with the team, rather than just like, sometimes I just try to be like, it's okay, we're gonna go and it's gonna be fine, and like, or I'd be like, we really need to turn this around, but like neither of them work, because it's either like fear pressure or naive optimism, I would call it. And I think like it starts with just like having that genuine conversation with the team, like, hey, okay, you know, results haven't been as good for now, and also, by the way, there shouldn't be a panic if it's one bad month. Growth does not go straight up. It goes up and down. But if we're seeing like a trend of things going on, we can say like, hey, we're seeing this happening. We're just going to take some time this sprint to just try and work out and see like, why do we think this is happening? Would love to also hear your guys' insights and figure out like, okay, what should we be focusing on? What will drive the impact? And then we can just change also a few of the things that we're doing to work that out, rather than just, you know, keep on it. And I think by getting everyone involved and also taking the time to zoom out with the team and discuss it from different perspectives and ask different people within the team, like, hey, why do you think, okay, how can we come together to do this? Can we have some sessions or brainstorms around it? And, you know, getting people's input onto that, it one just spreads the load of it also for yourself, but also helps the team feel like, hey, it's a group effort to get here. And before that, even, I think it's also about the OKRs, like, or whatever goal setting framework you use, that it's already always felt like a team effort. The growth team has always been a mix of people. It's never just been the head of growth working on it. But then when that moment comes, it's about that communication around it and figuring that out.
Do you think, because I'm just thinking for myself right now, because there's sometimes where I work in like bursts, and that sometimes it becomes very apparent to me that like I'm in this sort of real flow state that's like I'm like actually smashing through stuff, and then as a, you know, for the team, they're then seeing like me just on this like absolute rampage of stuff, and then other times it's like maybe flatter or whatever. And this could be like in a week, there could be like two different flows of that. And I'm wondering like if there's something to be said for this sort of like balance piece in the communications on things. So and that includes, I mean, obviously I'm an advocate for like celebrating wins and recognizing those, but even when things are going well, is there a space to be like, look, we're hitting all our metrics, but should we be like, are these the right kind of people that we're hitting our metrics with? Or like, you know, asking those questions to have a balanced approach to both like successful growth, as in you're hitting your numbers, and also when things, so just have that sort of framework for conversation that covers both sides all the time. And I feel like I'm sort of telling myself this while I'm saying it, but do you find that that's an approach that you don't want to take the enjoyment out of like the wins, but there's always, you know, lessons learned from wins and from slow periods?
So I think there's a few things in there. I think firstly, like whether growth is going well or not, just taking the time to celebrate wins with either setup, and really appreciate it, and not just wins shouldn't just be growth goals. They should be all types of things. Like Daniel added in the chat about how important it is to focus on people, building relationships, having genuine relationships with your customers, making them fans. Like if you have a measure of that and you see a growth in that, that is a win. That isn't one of the most incredible wins you can have, because you might not see that in the short-term growth rate, but the fact that you've unlocked what really drives that value, it, like when you were talking about retention, like working on retention and working on that, it's not going to immediately change it in that month, but it's going to be a killer impact in that year. So I think celebrate the wins when things aren't going well, celebrate the wins when things are going well, but make sure that they're never just focused on that one metric, because then it just becomes about that. And definitely highlight the learnings and make sure that I like to have as every growth meeting, like, what are we learning? What have we learned this last week? What are we going to do different from those learnings? What was a failure? You know, some brands share epic failures, and I think that's awesome too, that we're celebrating things where we failed and where we've learned, and we don't have a bad thing. The second thing I would say, you're talking about like with evaluating like the people of the team side, if you use a period of bad growth to say, basically, I've got the wrong people, I need to fire them. Because that's also what happens, by the way. It's not just like towards the head of growth, but like, this person's not doing their thing, that person, like a lot of people are pointing. If that's the moment that you're identifying that, I really question if you have a good setup for evaluating your team members and a good hiring setup. They're not saying you're going to always hire right. I've made so many flops in terms of hiring, and that's on me, not on those people, because it's also my job to evaluate and see who's the right fit. But it shouldn't just be like every time there's a bad period of growth, we identify someone, we fire them, because that's just creating such an awful fear culture. So I would also say, like, it's, you should be evaluating that when things are going well. You should constantly be looking at, like, hey, do we have the right people? How are we helping them, setting them up for success? But never have it when it's a bad period as that's the moment that you decide, oh, let's evaluate the team. That's also pulling everyone apart and finger pointing and creating a negative culture.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree. I completely agree. I think that's like toxic. And it also plays into the whole topic of this conversation that, like, if people aren't getting that communication, so they understand that they have the frameworks in place to look at how we can progress, even when things aren't going well, they're all going, like, people in, in every level of the team are going to be concerned every time things aren't going well, that they might, it might be their last month or whatever. And that's like no way to run something. But and if you have that communication as you're going along, then you can see when slow periods are extended periods, and there's something really wrong with, like, your product market fit or whatever it is. Okay, so let's get into, like, the common reasons that you're seeing or you see with why growth might stall or slow down. And we can talk about the recession in a second, but maybe just the sort of like day-to-day stuff regardless of macro.
So growth tends to stall at different, like, I'd say your own ceilings. Like, it tends to be like that you have a while of growth and then you kind of hit a ceiling, and it's like working out what needs to happen to get to the next level, like new growth level, basically. And so one of the key things that I see why people hit that level quite early on, and we can talk about reasons later on, is product market fit. It's the thing that everyone knows that they need to have but love to ignore. And you can grow, like, the myth is, oh, but we would never got any customers in if we didn't have product market fit. And the other myth is, but people love our product, so we must have product market fit. For me, product market fit is basically this combination of what's our product, who's our market, what are the channels that we're using, and what is the business model. And this is a like framework that's been suggested by Reforge, like having these four and having the interacting fits between them all. But I like to add another layer on that. I also talk about language, because that's also where I see it go wrong a lot. Sometimes they have a product that people love and they have a market for it, but it takes them like half an hour to explain it and actually get people on board, or a lot of effort to convert people. So I always layer on language on that. So I would always say, like, start with looking at those different fits. It always starts with, are we actually solving a problem? And do we have the right solution for that? And really working out the product market. And from there, we lay on the language side. Then we also make sure we have the right model, because, and the reason I also do this later is because often if people complain about price and you're like, oh no, it's just pricing's wrong. It's also a reflection of value. Are we communicating value effectively? So I like to solve that first versus dropping the price, because that's a hard thing to come back from. And it's also slightly harder to test. And then working out what's the right channels for it. And that's often, like, sometimes people do have the right product market fit, but they just haven't found the right scalable channels because they're doing the things that everyone is doing, Meta ads, Google ads, and email. And are just like, why is it not working? So that's like where I like to go back to, and like the foundations of it. And I like to just do also like a complete check of the customer journey, like where are we actually losing people, and look at it just from different aspects. Also in terms of like, hey, are we actually building our brand, or are we only focused on like acquisition channels? Because that will drive short-term growth, and then you'll hit a ceiling around that. How is, the retention of it? Because even if you have product market fit, you might not have done just the right things to retain people in the long term, or actually activate them as best as possible. And I just like to look at it all really holistically. And I think like that's like the product market fit side is the main reason I kind of see it happening at like a smaller phase.
Yeah.
And then at a bigger phase, and this is a bit less concrete maybe, but it ends up being focus. So people think like they've hit a ceiling and they have to focus on a new market or release new products, but actually they're nowhere near their ceiling, and they've just moved on to a colder audience probably. So they do have like, you know, the most aware, but within that same target audience, they're slightly less aware.
Mm-hmm.
And they just haven't worked out how to get that, or they have to really do things drastically different to get more out of their channel. Like I had a client who had been doing Facebook and Insta ads for ages, and it was doing okay, but it wasn't at any level that they could scale. And every time they were iterating a little bit, but it was only when they really revamped it, did a whole different landing page with an irresistible offer, created like user generated content, completely changed the way they were doing things, that the cost of acquisition dropped 4x and they were able to really truly scale it. So it might also just be like within the channel, you've hit a ceiling with the way you're doing it now, and you have to do something different. Doesn't mean a new channel, doesn't mean a new market, doesn't mean a new product immediately, but it's just like working out like and going through that step by step. And that's also, I think, what I see with a lot of growth and like growth people and founders is that they're so busy on a day-to-day basis that just taking the time to analyze these things just doesn't happen. And that's why it's also like the first thing I do when I work with any brand is just, even if they tell me we have an acquisition problem, I like to walk through all of this to make sure like, hey, is what we think is the growth devil the actual growth devil, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, like I resonate a lot with that, even like previous things that I've done, or even just people I know, like, and it is so hard especially like as an early stage founder, if you are just like getting started, you've had some good early traction, and then, you know, what you're doing doesn't continue to work. It's scary. And it's like, oh my God, like, is this it? Like, are we not going to get any further? And like you said, the capacity to zoom out is difficult. I mean, we're going through a phase at the moment that I'm sort of happy to talk about, but where we and this will segue onto the recession, I think, but we have faced a lot of like our product market fit. I mean, which I don't think we've ever got to a point where we've reached it because of all the things that you just said. But we have like elements of it, they're just not connecting. And we now are in this phase of like, right, we're going to recalibrate. We're going to go back to our customers. We're going to go back and speak to everyone. We're going to, and I've been spent the last couple of weeks surveying and interviewing our like actual target audience, because we got into this thing over about 6 months of not really talking to anyone other than trying to sell, because we were like, shit, we really need to sell because like our investors are going to need to hear that, and and then going like just keeping on hammering at things that just weren't like working, and we're just like, if we just keep doing this, or we just keep building features, or we just keep doing this. And I mean, it's like I say it out loud, and it's like the stuff that everyone says to you, just like just sort it out and take a step back. And now we're doing that, and it's so interesting because we're seeing that like we're not far off a lot of the stuff that we're wanting to do based on the insights we're getting from these conversations, but it's like we're now understanding where those things are disconnected, and what like and we started, and I think a lot of founders do this, and I imagine you'd advise against this, but a lot of founders start with like the channels, I guess. They're just like, oh well, we'll just sell it like this and it'll be fine, and like my product's going to be great and everyone's going to want it, and it's going to be, you know, great, because you just have to like put yourself up to tell yourself that. And but actually they don't look at it, and no one wants to like admit that to themselves, because they want to believe that it's, you know, it is what it, like they think it is to the people that they think want it. And that piece about like, I mean, like talking to people is to me one of them. Like I've been sort of saying it to all my founder friends over the last like couple of months, just since we've been doing it, because I'm like, this is the best thing we've done. Like just stop building and be like, let's go speak to people and see what they actually think, because you just have, there's so much wealth of insights in that in doing that. But anyway, I've gone off on one. The next thing I wanted to speak about, and I think we will talk a bit more about going back to speak to your customers probably, but the recession and how like that's going to be impacting a lot of companies, whether they're like really starting out early or like they're on a growth trajectory, I mean, and even bigger companies, we're going to see a lot of companies facing stalling growth rates. And if we have this idea that people's, you know, moods and everything are aligned with that, then we've got a bit of a problem, because everyone's going to be really struggling. So what advice do you have for brands facing stalls right now based on the recession?
So before we get to that, if it's okay, I'd just love to touch on what you said about the research, because I think this is one of the biggest things I advise companies in the space, is just to do jobs to be done research. Like, what would you say is the aha moment that made you rave about doing those interviews to all of your founders, or the other founders?
So for me, it was, so I decided to do it because I was like, something's not working here. And, you know, we had a couple of like probably about 3 or 4 months where I was like really struggling to land like messaging, to land like the salespeople people were like teetering on the edge. They were like, yeah, we really like this, but and so that was just getting too much. And then actually the sort of catalyst for doing the research was there was a change in our team that meant that like I needed to get on top of all of this sort of stuff. So so I was like, right, we're going to stop, because I just need to like I personally need to work out what the hell's going on. And then it was after so there was a couple of aha moments. One was like, okay, who are we going to be asking questions of? Because one of the problems we had or have in our platform is we have too many people that need to be involved in the platform for it to work. So we have the brands that are, you know, utilizing the platform. We have their agencies that are running their ads. We then have the charity partners that they have, and then we have the end consumer, which is the person that's sort of interacting with the ads to unlock donations. And I was like, whoa, too many people. Like, and we mapped out our customer journey. And that, so the first aha moment was like, oh my God, let's actually properly define our target audience. I feel like I shouldn't be admitting all of this, but so there's that part.
I think it's good. It makes it real for other brands, because like I think a lot of brands have this, like they have some fluffy persona, and then suddenly when it's like, hey, it's not working. Okay, how can we really understand these people? It just says
exactly.
50
I didn't know who I was going to speak to. I was like, I actually don't know who I'm going to send the survey to. So I'm like, okay, right. The people that like, so I look back at all the stuff that we've done so far, and like who's resonating the most, and like who's got like who's the actual buyer, and who's da 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 da. So basically we were like, right, okay, agencies is our channel. So let's for now, let's just speak to them. And so that was aha moment number one. The second one was when I actually started getting so then we did to sort of to frame the questions, I started basically putting in an assumptions framework for because I was like, there's all these things I think that everyone's saying to me, but I don't really know. So I was like, okay, I'll put them in a framework. And one of my advisors sort of helped me put this together, but it was essentially a risk certainty framework, and then drew down questions from that. And then we asked, so we were surveying, and so aha moment number 2 was like, we've got loads of assumptions that we actually probably don't know the answer to right now, and we really need to speak to them to understand whether these things are actually true. And then aha moment number 3 was when I actually started getting people's responses and then interviewing people as well, because the survey responses are one thing, but the interviews, when I actually sort of framed them properly, didn't know bias, like actually just sat there and was like, right, question, you know. The stuff that people come out with, they're literally giving you the answers. And I was like, this is the best thing. Why aren't I doing this? Like, firstly, why haven't I been doing this for the last 6 to 9 months? And I think a lot of that is about fear, because you don't really want to hear if someone's telling you actually the thing that you're building is probably not the thing we want to buy. But then actually then now, because I'm going into it with a frame of like, okay, well, there might be something here that we can, like, we need to shift what we're doing. So we have the same purpose, but we're maybe building the wrong thing to meet that. But let's actually ask people rather than not. and just like go with our assumptions again, because I could go and build something tomorrow that I have based on my assumptions from the conversations I've had, but actually framing that and then asking the sort of how might we questions rather than anything else. Anyway, I rambled on, but there was a couple of aha moments, and now I'm just evangelizing to everyone. Go and speak to your bloody customers.
So yeah, I think like the reason why I thought it was important to dive in is because this is one of the first things I ask also these brands is, when did you last talk to your customers? Because if it's been like more than a year ago that they've done an interview, and I don't count surveys, because like you say, with the minute you actually talk to them versus a survey, that's when you got that juice. And I was even doing these jobs to be done interviews before we talk, like I mentioned to you before we got on the call. And it's just so insightful every time, because you can dive deeper, you can really understand, you can hear someone talk, you can see their emotion. And we can't get that from written communication. So like in terms of the qualitative research, I would say doing this is so impactful if you think we're not focusing on the right audience, we don't know our audience well enough, we're not sure where to find them. Like it can answer so many questions. Polly, in terms of the question you asked for the chat, which was like, in this analysis phase, trying to find out the growth devil, do you have any particular mental models useful? For example, do you map out the funnel and try to find a root cause? Definitely. So there's a few ways I go about it. The first is just from the North Star metric, is working backwards in terms of metrics of like, what is the most closely related metric to the North Star metric? What are the ones under that? And just checking the performance across those. That's just a really quick way to get a feel of your high level metrics. So let's say your North Star metric is monthly active customers, then new customers is a growth lever that sits under that. Returning customers, probably something around like the churn rate for that, to work that out. Your conversion rate, all these different parts are a part of that, in working out like, okay, how are we increasing the number of monthly customers? What I ideally like to do though is work out what the growth model looks like. And I use a combination of funnels and loops personally, because I think funnels just lead to very linear growth, but loops also need momentum, and especially in a startup will not get you there if you only focus on loops. And I just work out like, okay, what are the different steps of each of the main channels that are actually working versus what we want to use, and just work out the metrics and the conversion rate of each part. And I use like a traffic light system of which ones are green in terms of like they're performing where we'd expect them to be, they're doing well, which ones are orange and which ones are red. And I use that to work out like where are the different areas. But I think that like tells you maybe where is their potential issue. Like if you map it out and you see like, hey, we have nothing that's leading in terms of funnel, in terms of brand awareness, or we have nothing that's actually a loop that's helping us gain momentum, so it's very linear growth. But the why really comes from that qualitative research. And one of the most impactful ones is just what you talked about, that jobs to be done. So I hope that helps answer your question, Polly. And like,
great segue.
Do you have any follow-up questions? Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we did like talk a bit about that, because I think like you mentioned the jobs to be done, like research very like enthusiastically, but like we just passed by on it. But I do think it's so impactful. And then I wanted to make sure we answered Polly's question before we talked a bit about the recession, because I appreciate that is a really, really a big impact point for a lot of brands right now.
Yeah, I'm conscious that just on the jobs to be done piece, I'm conscious that we're doing it because we had this sort of catalyst piece where like we weren't hitting like, and well, to be honest, it's like kind of the sort of standard framework we're looking at here, which is like we weren't hitting the things that we wanted to. And actually, I'm kind of proud of myself. I feel like we've done the right things, but it got to the point where we were like, right, something's got to change. We're going to have to stop and really like pull ourselves back. But for those people, the growth people out there, or the founders and all those sorts of everyone, how do people do this continuously to be able to, because it always comes as a thing that's like, oh shit, everything's bad. Now I'm going to take Daphne's advice and go and speak to my customers. How do we keep that moving and make sure that we've got those feedback loops, the qualitative ones?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that a lot of companies struggle with, is creating an ongoing system. And so I personally like to, rather than doing a one-off product market fit research, is I like to have it in the onboarding flow if we have enough customers for it, just to ask them after that, rather than just asking like an NPS, actually asking in product market fit and working out like, okay, how is that performing? And then from there, often like based on then like the response, like we'll also like I like to include like an automated email at some point of, asking for a call, and just to have standard time in your agenda. Like, let's say you use Calendly, you can set up a separate agenda just for user testing, where you have a standard block every single week or every 2 weeks where people can book in slots and for a reward. And that's what that's what we used to do at Heights. And who took those calls? It really varied. One moment, like, the founder Joel was taking those calls. One moment, Adam was taking those calls, the head of product. One moment, I was taking them. But it was a really nice way to have those constant talks. And so that's one thing that you can do, is like, rather than see it as this big project, just block a certain amount of time that the team spends on it, rotate who's talking to it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I like to do to keep it top of mind is, because I believe that surveys, like I said before, they just don't capture the reality of a customer. So I like to also ask for permission, and you have to sort this all out GDPR wise, whether you do it with like a form or asking permission on the call. I can't give any advice around that. That's up to your company. But I'm always like, I do not give legal advice. Will not dip my toes in that. But what I did at Heights was I would get permission to record the calls, and I would actually do it on Zoom and just keep the audio files. And we had a Notion page, which was, we called it executive function because we were focused on brain health. So the executive function is part of your brain, for those who don't know that. And we would have podcast episodes of customer interviews. And we basically share it also on Slack, and like encourage people to listen to it. And also, like, I would share, like, almost like you would with a normal podcast episode, like, give it a catchy title, give it a few bullet points that you could learn. I'd tag certain people in it. And I did that together with the product manager, Jules, who's absolutely incredible at all of this. And we would basically do those interviews, record them, and share them with the team, and would like aggressively tag everyone to get everyone to listen. And the thing was, like, people didn't have an excuse, because you can say, I can't join that meeting, I have another meeting. But you could basically go for a walk and listen back to this interview. Or you could just, while you're cooking, listen to this interview. And I'm not saying you should be listening to interviews all the time and not have a work-life balance, but I'm saying, like, during the day, if you wanted to go for a walk and you're like, hey, I want to feel like I am working, just listen to one of those interviews, and it's so impactful. And I'm doing this with a brand right now, and they're like listening back to all these interviews, and they're just like, there's so many little aha moments from different people. Like, the customer care person sees something different to the brand person, who sees something different to the growth person, and then bringing all those insights together. So I think things like that is just really impactful. And also just integrating it into your meeting. So whenever I share also insights in meetings, I like to have the exact quotes of people, because even though it's not quite the same as them hearing it, then at least it's as close as possible to the human aspect of it, and just having that inside to everything you do.
Yeah, and I suppose there can be bias in like or paraphrasing or translating something that someone said. My next question was going to be, how do you filter that around to the team? But I think that's like really good advice. I really like the sort of internal marketing, content marketing piece, and I think that's a really good idea. Do you think with those types of interviews, and I know obviously like you're not going to be wooden and say like, we're going to ask X amount of questions and they have to be in the right order, et cetera, and things prompt further questions, but do you propose having like a framework for asking the right questions in those, so that everyone's sort of getting the same framing of the answers, if you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so like, properly build that.
I have 3 templates. I have, sorry, I just realized I'm Dutch, so I never pronounce free correctly. I don't pronounce it. 3 templates. One is for existing customers. So it's got a run through of questions. Do I robotically stick to that order? No. Do I ask a question if I've already felt they've answered it once or twice with other questions? No, because then you just get a really annoyed customer who starts skimming through answers. So I have that guideline. I do try to cover everything, or make sure I at least have an answer to everything. But I will be also very conscious of the situation, that if it doesn't make sense to ask something, I'm not going to ask it. And then I'd rather skip over it. And I don't stick to one order, but I try to let the conversation flow. I try to build also that trust to begin with, so that they can be open. I mentioned the Dutch thing because I'm like, we're very direct. We're brutally direct. So don't worry. Anything you say, you can't offend me in the slightest. And I try to keep that conversation flowing versus bam, bam, bam. And I also dive deep into certain things. So even though I have the same script, if they mention something specific, like I had someone mention this morning a reason why they didn't use one of the products. then I'm like, okay, well, that's not part of the script, but it's really valuable for the company to know why someone's consciously not choosing to use one of their products versus using another. So I'll ask further about that. Then I have the second one I have is for cancelled customers. So there I basically have like the main reasons why people cancel: price, features, no longer relevant, so short-term use, and a few others. And then I have questions based on that. So for example, with price, it's like, what would have made the product / service valuable enough to justify the price versus, okay, why was it too expensive? So trying to understand what's driving that value, because like I said earlier, value, price. And so I have set questions I use for that next to like the same starting questions. And then the third template I have is for user testing, which is when I'm working with non-customers who've never tried it. I do some of the jobs to be done in questions with them, understand like how they're looking for products, what they've done it, but I can't ask them any of the things that they experience with the product. So instead, I like to do like a walkthrough of the website and get their feedback on that. And again, I have set questions after that of like how their experience was. Did anything surprise? Did anything frustrate them? What would they change? So yeah, I have those kind of free scripts that I use as a basis for all customers. But then working together with each customer, I try to customize it also if there's other questions, if they're doing any product research and stuff. But I do think it's really important to have a consistent template to make sure that you're able to start to identify trends, and you're also getting the right insights out of it, and you don't end the research with, oh, I wish we knew this. And I think the key thing is like, what is your hypothesis when you're doing this research? What is the reason you're doing this research, and what questions do you need to ask to be able to work out if that hypothesis is true or false, versus going in there and just seeing where it goes. Like there's ongoing research, but there's also like very focus driven, and then you really need to make sure you're asking the right questions for it.
Yeah. And I suppose there's that sort of internal feedback for anyone asking those questions as well, when they're learning from how people are responding to different framing of questions. And I mean, I've found this over the course of doing like 10 to 12 interviews over the last week or so. Some people respond better to different types of questions, and feeding that back with other people that are doing it, so that you're all learning and getting the most out of it for everyone.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. The only thing I'd say with it is just is to try and avoid loaded questions.
Yeah, like, definitely.
And to try to make it as open-ended as possible. Like you always have people who say no feedback. Like that always happens. But like for example, one of the ones I'm interviewing around, we're looking at like, okay, should we combine a product? Rather than asking them, would you use it, or would you like it? Like we're trying to ask, like, do you have any concerns? Are there any, and that's really, really interesting, because we get far more detailed answers about like, oh, but would it work as well for function X versus Y? Like, so just try to make sure that you put it in a way that doesn't like lead them too much. Like concerns could lead them to think negatively, but in this case, we're trying to de-risk the assumption of like people don't mind it. So we are really trying to get them to be critical, and it's not a reason to not do it, but it's a reason to be conscious of like who does it suit and who does it not.
I'm thinking to myself that we're not going to skip over the recession, but I think it's really interesting that like, I mean, the start of this whole conversation is around like, how do we like decouple this idea that like we're sort of more stressed, more like low energy when our growth rates are low. But actually, like just talking this through, it seems that there's actually a real benefit in some ways. Like if it's a catalyst for doing those things where you're talking to your customers and understanding your product market fit and testing your assumptions and building those processes in. Everyone wants to do this from day one. No one does. But it seems like there's a force that if you're willing to see the opportunity in a slowdown, there's an opportunity to get the fundamentals right and build that stuff back up from a position of strength and understanding. So maybe that's a sort of one takeaway from how we can decouple this idea and say like, see it as an opportunity to really dig deep on why it's not working.
It'll make you stronger. And if you look at it from a personal aspect, it's the things that are the hardest that we struggle with the most, that help us grow the most. Like, just even like with running a race, like at the very beginning of a conversation, like running something like that and pushing yourself is what makes you stronger. Is it easy at the moment? No, but afterwards you get stronger. And I've seen so many companies actually flourish and grow because of this. Like I know a company who had an 18-month slowdown, 18 months.
Wow.
And they are now one of the biggest in their space. But it forced them to really work out who is actually the right audience for them, how to build their brand, because they were very focused on acquisition, work out what the best pricing models were. And they just got the fundamentals all right. And then it went bam. But it's a natural part of it. And I think it's almost why I really like bootstrapped companies, to be honest, because I think it is a lot harder. And I really appreciate that. It's hard. It's a far harder situation. Sometimes growth is held back by the financials, but it forces you to focus on building those relationships, getting that product market fit right, really, really delivering value, because you can't just throw money at the problem. You can't just acquire new customers and then the funding runs out and then you're suddenly like, we have a growth stall.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I definitely think like, don't see it as a bad thing. That's a really good point. Like one of the ways to turn it around is see it as an opportunity as well.
Yeah. Okay, so the recession.
Yeah, the elephant in the room. So
everyone's struggling.
Yeah. So first of all, just like to reassure brands out there, like I am seeing quite a high churn rate compared to before. I am seeing brands have it that previously loyal customers aren't able to stay. I think kind of expect that, but I think just to reassure you, you're not the only one. If you are struggling with that, it's really normal. Like I think the challenge, especially at the beginning of a recession, is we have this panic moment where we cancel all our subscriptions and we're like, okay, we really need to reduce costs. And also a lot of people are actually, it's a choice. Like, do I pay for my Netflix or am I able to pay my gas bill? Like the increases aren't small. Like my gas, water, electricity just doubled last month. Like that's not nothing. So yeah, there are these really hard choices. And I think, being considerate of those customers and how you handle the situations is really key. But I think the other thing is like, again, going back to drawing board, because you'll see that not everyone churns. Like not everyone is equally price sensitive. Not everyone sees it as like, like if you talk about like painkiller products versus vitamins, the people who see products as vitamins, they're more likely to churn. So we look at heights, like, one of the main churn reasons was I don't feel different from taking the brain supplement. But the people who would not churn in a situation like this are the people who are like, I'm finally sleeping 7 instead of 5 hours per night because it's really helping me with my insomnia. And that's not everyone, but I think like going back to drawing board and working out who are those painkiller customers, who are the ones who are less price sensitive, like your product market fit might have shifted. You might have to focus on a slightly different audience. Like, you might have to focus on a different use case because your use case isn't as relevant during a recession, or that's what COVID also forced us to do. Use cases definitely shifted there. And so I would say, like, go back to drawing board, make sure like, hey, who are we really focusing on? Use this as a chance to be more efficient in how you're doing things, but try not to go into panic mode of switching everything off. Because if you're switching all like, if you're restricting budget on, getting support from coaches and mentors, if you're restricting budget on spend on all channels, if you're restricting hiring, like it's not going to help you forward. It might improve your run rate in the short run. And yes, you should be really critical at that point of time of what's efficient spend, what's not, but also be conscious of like, hey, if we want to keep growing, if we want to, ensure that we can survive beyond that, we are going to need some income, whether that's through focusing on those existing customers and new customers. I would say the biggest opportunity and the trend that I would say for 2023, because a lot of people always ask me like, what marketing channel is going to be the trend for 2023? And I'm like, no, the trend for me is going to be retention. It's going to be focusing on customer lifetime value. And that's how I think you was to survive a moment like this, is like existing customers are far cheaper to retain versus new customers. It makes me think back of the comment that Daniel did in the chat about like having these genuine relationships, creating these fans. Like I would say, like really take this opportunity to double down on that versus like, okay, only focusing on like, how can we get more people on board, but like, how can we improve the experience for the people who are staying? How can we make it better? How can we ensure that we're being considerate of what they need and building that relationship with them, because they're the ones who are going to help you through it. And who they are might have changed, and you might not need to go back to drawing board and do all the research we talked about. But that will be a much more impactful strategy, in my opinion, to get through it. And like, I have to think, for example, All Plants, who does, for those not familiar, they do vegan freezer meal subscription. And like, that's for me one of my bigger expenses, is like getting one of them every, like, I don't do it every 2 weeks like the subscription usually is, but I could do it every 2 months or so. But it is a big expense. But like, when they emailed me and said like, hey, we're dropping our prices, and obviously not every brand can do this, but we've, our goal was to make it easier to eat more plant-based, and we decided to drop our plan. The fact that they timed that so well with the recession, and JP, the founder, told me that they've been thinking about this for longer, but I was just like, the timing of that, when every single brand was emailing me, we're increasing our prices. And I was getting frustrated that my dog food subscription was getting more. Every subscription I had increased in price, basically. And that they emailed me. And it was literally £0.50 per meal.
Yeah.
Grand scheme of things, probably based on me getting like 6 meals every 2 months. We're talking about £20, maybe. That's really bad math, but around about that per year. But that just made me so loyal to them, and even mention it here, because I was like, wow, that's incredible. And I think like, seeing like, okay, what do your customers need right now, and how can you support them in a time like this? And maybe you can't give them a discount, but maybe you can offer that if they buy more from you, that they get a better price, something like that. Like, okay, if you end up buying more, then we can offer you a better price because we're shipping all in one go.
Yeah.
Or we'll offer better payment terms for you if we can afford it ourselves in terms of runway. Like, just trying to think with those customers, what are things you can do to delight and make them happy and make them really true fans? I think that's what will help you through the recession too.
Well, and again, it all comes back to like understanding the audience and what they need and what they want. I mean,
I end up doing so much research.
Yeah, I mean, but you're right. And I think like, we know the sort of macro problems that people are facing, and also there's that sort of level of panic, because everyone, if like, I can't imagine anyone in Britain, and probably lots of other countries too, haven't said the word cost of living crisis at some point in the last 2 months. But that sort of also, like, you feel it properly in terms of like, you literally see your bills and they are going up, but you also feel it in that sort of collective sense that everyone's talking about, like, this is the thing that we're talking about. So like, so even if you're not necessarily cutting your spending right now, you are already thinking like, oh, do I need that? Or like, you're starting to filter out the things that you don't need, because you don't know how hard it's going to hit you. And at some point you may not be able to afford lots of different things. So I went through my like app subscriptions the other day to see which ones I'm actually using, because some of them, they're just like, £2 a month. And I'm like, well, I don't use that, so that can go. But it's like, but maybe if they had said to me, or like, for the next 3 months, which will probably be the like core period of this like panic phase or whatever, we're going to half our prices for that period. But that then keeps more people coming out the other side. And I think this is the sort of classic, especially in marketing, like, don't turn the taps off in terms of your budget and things. Just make sure you're spending your budget right through a recession, because otherwise you're not going to come out the other side with anyone left, because you're just like mothballing, and then you're restarting. So like, just really address those like the pain points, and make sure you're meeting them, and use this almost again as an opportunity to really get back down to basics, and not all the like, you're not going to sell your product on a messaging point now. Probably it's going to be on like real pain relievers.
No, like, I really find it important not to highlight that it's not to like under appreciate how hard this period is, because there are people who are losing their jobs, and there are people who are like, there are companies that will go down, and it's such a shame. Like, I saw a message the other day on that Made.com weren't able to get funding, and had like closed their online store temporarily. This was a week ago. I don't read news, to be honest, for my own mental well-being, so I may have missed the latest status of this. But like, I think like, it's like you say, it's that chance to get to the basics. And if you talk about that app you were just talking about, that discount would have probably even come too late, because if you're not using it, at half a price wouldn't have made you stay. And like, that's the thing, like, a lot of people think that they have to be reactive in a time like this, but be proactive. Figure out like, I think Elena Werner calls it like sleeping bears. Like, these customers who aren't actually using it, and the minute you like poke them with like, hey, you're gonna renew it, they just like churn, and they're like, like a sleeping polar bear that just turns around and roars and goes away. If you have a huge inactive base, why are they inactive? What could have prevented them?
Exactly.
How can you do it those steps before? Because reactivating churned customers is really, really hard, but getting the first activation right and not losing, and then the retention after that, that's easier to impact than to get someone back who's left. So yeah, I would definitely say also focus on that.
Definitely. Yeah, it's going to be a horrible time for many, and an interesting time for a lot as well, in terms of what they're going to learn and what we're going to learn about. You know, I think there's going to be a lot of, for especially sort of early stage startups, there's going to be a bit of a reckoning phase, which is, you know, probably some will be unfair and some will be like not fair, but, you know, not great. But and it's going to be an interesting period, as long as we can, you know, people can survive it and see what they learn through it. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I feel like we could talk forever, but so in terms of like strategy, I mean, I think we've kind of sort of covered a lot of this, but like how can people turn things around when things aren't going right?
Yeah. So number one, take a step back, take the time to zoom out, go through the data, look from different viewpoints, from like, you know, like I said, from growth to brand to product, and also to map out what your growth model is if you haven't already, and to analyze all the different metrics and how things are performing. Develop hypotheses around it based on that. Which of the fits do you think you're missing? Which of the parts of the journey aren't working? And map out different hypotheses around that, and dive deep and enrich that with qualitative data. And then just start testing it step by step. Focus on learning. You won't always see immediately the growth rate changing, especially if it's a retention problem, but it doesn't mean you're on the wrong track. So focus on what are you learning? How are you making steps with that? And just bring the team together really as you do all of that. Don't do that alone. Do this whole analysis, do this whole like brainstorming session around it all together. And then, yeah, to approach it step by step. And it might take time, but I really believe if you get back to the fundamentals, you'll start to see the end results of that approach.
Great. You're amazing. And that was such a good chat. And I'm really I feel quite validated that we're doing the right things, which is good. And I feel better about the fact that like there's something good come out of what we're doing, because we're getting back to the basics and understanding things. We do have some like exciting things hopefully coming up off the back of that as well. So yeah, I'm a living example of getting back to the basics turns this sort of space into an opportunity, rather than something where you can just start to feel like really rotten about it. So yeah, thank you so much. For anyone that's watching this that wants to follow up with any questions, we're in the Impact Marketing Club Slack, so you can ask some questions in there. And otherwise connect with Daphne on LinkedIn, because she shares some really good stuff and more stuff like this. But yeah, thanks a million. And is there anything else you want to say before we close off?
No, I think we've covered it all. Really appreciate everyone who's joined. And yeah, feel free to reach out. And I would just say like one other tip, like definitely join communities if you aren't able to afford like, you know, getting more higher or getting the hires you want in this period. And also something like Growth Mentor. I do like 4 to 8 free sessions on there a month for startups. So it's really reasonable considering what you get. So just use things like that to help and support you, and not go at it alone. I think that would be my last tip for it.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Bye.